minutes, half an hour of discussion, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. You can submit questions through chat, and we'll address them as they come. Tonight's session is entitled, What It Means to Be an Anti-Racist, a White Male Anti-Racist Accomplice. And before we get going, we're just going to talk about a couple terms here. So one of the difficulties in talking about racism is that it's a word that has multiple meanings. And racism is both an idea and a structural condition. And a good simple definition of racism is the belief that races can be placed in a hierarchy and some races are better than others. Real simple, good working definition. This is a definition that Ibram Kendi uses, and it's easy for folks to understand. So one of the things that is a little more difficult is when we talk about racism as a structural condition. And to me though, that is really the rub, because it's not just an idea. If racism was just an idea, it would be prejudice. Oh, sorry, we got someone that wasn't muted, which is bad enough. But these ideas fit into structures that have actual real material negative impacts on people's lives. And how we start to combat that is first by combating the ideas and then trying to dismantle these structures. So power is a big part of this. One other thing that Dr. Kendi says about racism in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, is that racist is often used as a pejorative. And he encourages people to look at it as a descriptive word, not just an insult, but a way to describe certain behaviors, speech, methods of being in the world. The obverse to that is anti-racist. And Kendi argues that there's no such thing as being non-racist. You can either have racist ideas or have non-racist ideas. There's no sort of middle ground. And what we're going to try to grapple with tonight is being anti-racist and trying to keep anti-racist ideas and actions in the forefront. This isn't a state of being. You don't all of a sudden become anti-racist. It's a lifelong project, action, process. I'm kind of reminded by something John Lewis wrote, and that freedom is not a state of being. Freedom is an action. And to be anti-racist is to be an action. And you can move between these things. You can be racist one moment and anti-racist the next. And I think it's really important to keep that, I think, in the forefront of our minds, because what we're trying to do here is build what scholars would call a praxis, which is a theoretically informed practice. And so what we're going to do here is take some ideas from critical race theory and studies about racism and build our own personal practices on being anti-racist. One question somebody asked me when I told them I was going to moderate this panel is, why white male? Why is that important? And that was a great question. First off, because of intersectionality. And this is a term that was coined by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, who's a lawyer, scholar, and an activist. And it speaks to how other parts of our identity, such as our gender or our social class, play into social relations to create different experiences of discrimination or privilege. And as white men, we have a tremendous amount of power in American society. We do. I think that is a fact, and there's no way to dance around that. We also have privilege, which is something we're going to talk about a little bit more tonight. with the panelists. You know, and then finally, the last thing we just want to define is accomplice. So it was Dr. Michelle Cromwell that first brought up this idea of complicity and being an accomplice in the first session. And what they meant by accomplice denotes a little bit more of a level of commitment. It's getting out there and doing things. Like the folks who put the chalk messages and flyers in Saranac Lake a couple of weeks ago were acting as anti-racist accomplices because they were taking that message and putting it out for all the world to see. And I think that was a really important action. And I've heard other people kind of say, oh, it's just chalk messages. But you know what? Words are super important. Words are the first step towards changing things. So kudos to those folks. All right, so now I'm going to start asking the panelists some questions. And how about the three of you guys, if I just put them out there, and if somebody wants to answer, just, we can do it that way? How does that sound?
Sure.
Yeah. So let's start off with what our session is entitled, what does it mean to you to be a white male anti-racist accomplice?
I can jump in and start and be really frank in saying that this terminology is all new to me, and maybe it's new to a lot of people listening and a lot of people engaging in this. I understand that it's a title that is assigned to you by a Black person or a person of color, and it's something that can be taken away too. Adam talked about that sort of spectrum of being anti-racist and racist. You know, you can let your foot off the gas and fall back into those racist habits really easily. So from my perspective, which I think still feels pretty limited to me, I think being a white male anti-racist accomplice means being incredibly unwavering in standing up for Black people and racial justice and transformational justice. It means being unafraid of the backlash, whether you're getting it from overtly racist people or the All Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter people, or from your own friends and fellow activists too, which I think maybe is the most important thing. And so speaking personally, I grew up here in Saranac Lake. I feel like I know everyone sometimes, and sometimes I just want to be invisible so I can just navigate my day and be left alone. And so becoming more and more outspoken over the years means I've lost some friends, people I grew up with, definitely lost some respect. That used to really, really bother me. And it still bothers me sometimes because it's not easy. And it bothered me to the point where I tamped down my own voice and my own activism at points. So that's my 2 cents, I guess, is finding the courage to speak up and act without fearing the consequences, especially in these small communities. It's doing what's right versus what's easy and holding yourself accountable when you are taking the easy way out, which I've done before. I admit it. And I try to be better about it, but that's my 2 cents from my perspective.
Thanks, Chris. You brought up a really important point that this is not a label that you should ascribe to yourself, that this is something that is given to you because of your actions. And I think that can kind of keep you centered and on the right track. I've had a similar trajectory to yours where I've kind of felt afraid of backlash and tamped down stuff and not spoken out. I thought your piece in the Enterprise on that was really great and a really, really good call to action for folks. Pete or Paul?
I'll jump in. Hello again, everybody. I've had a couple words in mind as I thought about this session that are integrated for me into a larger whole that is along the lines of what Adam's talked about. It's not so much theoretical as it is livable and practical. And those two words are perspective and discomfort. So what I have found as a white male draped in privilege is that the perspective by which we look at issues in our society is a difference maker. If diversity was the active word here, and we were talking about everybody's on the same level, isn't that great? Maybe it would be a different way to talk about this. But I see this. And I've seen this since I was a kid. I've seen that there's a gradient in our culture, in our society, in multiple layers. And that when you sit in a position of privilege, it is sometimes difficult to have a perspective on it. Let me give you a couple of examples. When I was a little kid, where really this all started for me, I took a job, I think it was in 4th grade, mowing lawns for a guy who had duplexes in my neighborhood. And one afternoon, he pulled up and asked me if I had seen any black people moving in and would I keep an eye out for them. Interesting for me to think years later that it would be unlikely to see that kind of perspective that he offered reversed. 3 decades later, in the neighborhood that I lived in, I became good friends with a guy down the street who happened to be black and who was just used to the fact that on any afternoon when he was working on his lawn, somebody was sure to stop their car and say, after you're done with this property, how'd you like to do my property? Can you imagine for a minute that perspective being reversed with a white person in a primarily black neighborhood being asked that question? That issue of perspective is gigantic. And it takes, as Chris said, a little courage to live outside the privileged mindset that you have and start to embrace what that perspective is. My brother wrote a column recently, he's a writer, and he nailed it when he said that the idea that some people of privilege think that they have the unexamined privilege to tell other people how they should feel. Oh, you know, you shouldn't feel racist. Oh, you know, grow a thick skin. Oh, you know, we don't have a problem here. Imagine reversing that perspective and having people of color, black people, poor people tell you how you should feel about something and how that would be responded to. Discomfort is important. We can't face the questions and challenges of perspective that drive everything that I do with this without a little courage and without a willingness to accept discomfort. That's what sitting high in a position of privilege is all about.
That's great, Pete. Thank you. And I think you really, we're going to get to privilege in a little bit here, but I think you really kind of nailed it. And privilege is a term, I think, in this context that trips up a lot of people. At least that's been my experience in talking about race and racism with other white folks and the sense of white privilege. But, you know, because I think we tend to think of privilege as something that's added or a bonus that we have. And you know, the way you were just talking about it, it's really our privilege is that we don't have to think about this stuff and we don't have to confront it. You know, we don't have to have, as W.E.B. Du Bois wrote, the double consciousness of a person being in the world and also our skin color, our race. So thank you for that. Paul?
Yep, waiting for brilliant. So what does it mean to me? So this has been a journey of discovery for me over the last 20 years. And I think what being an accomplice at this point, I mean, accomplice is a word, as Chris mentioned, that's brand new. It's actually a word that, quite frankly, I'm uncomfortable with. And I'm uncomfortable with it because I think it has negative connotations, and I think the work that we're doing is positive. So despite that, the statements that we're exploring about whether you stand by or stand up, it's one thing to stand by people and support them. It's another thing to stand up next to them. And so being an accomplice absolutely means standing up and acting with, to me. It is something that also, I think, really, as I've become more and more involved in this, being an accomplice also means making space. In the Adirondacks, obviously, we don't have a high level of diversity here. As Peter was mentioning earlier, we, as white males, we have a lot of privilege and we have a lot of power. I'm on the older end of the spectrum, and so I benefit from a lot of that assumption of, oh, older white male, you must know something, so we're going to give you the microphone and we're going to let you talk. And recognizing that that's actually not good, that what feels like an honor is actually a trap. and that we need to make space for others to speak. And that's probably the most powerful thing that I think that comes to the top of my mind about being an accomplice, is recognizing that even though people may look to me because I've been working professionally in the Adirondacks for 20 years, and they may cede space to me, that I should not accept that space and make sure that I'm offering that space to others.
Thank you, Paul. And I think that, you know, what you said about offering space is hugely important. You know, you want to stand up and be there for people, but it's also important sometimes as a white man to step back and let other people, you know, be centered and have that. You know, Sheryl Sandberg wrote that famous book, or talked about leading in. And I think what we need to do a lot of the times is to lean out and be there for support, and kind of keep our voice quiet a little bit and let other people have the floor. So on that note, what are some other, I don't like that. I'm also kind of uncomfortable with accomplice too, because, you know, as you said, that negative connotation, and this is good work, but I also think that, you know, the idea of complicity carries with it this idea of a very deep commitment. And, you know, to invoke John Lewis again, to maybe get into that good trouble with other people. I don't like the term best practices, but can any of you talk about what some good practices when you're doing this work and trying to build your personal practice of anti-racism? What some good practices might be?
I'd like to jump in just because my first point on this one was sort of sounds contrary to what Paul was just saying. I think there's a trap that can be fallen into with making space too much, to where I went so far in the opposite direction that I forgot that there are situations, especially in white rural America, where my voice brings a power dynamic shift to the conversation. So when Nikki or Clifton or any of the other people I work with on the core team show up, they can be dismissed as an agitator or an outsider. And there are situations where I can walk into the room and say, I am a white man, I'm from Saranac Lake, and it is much more difficult to dismiss me out of hand when we're having those conversations about police reform or systemic racism or the unsafetyness of a Black student at North Country Community College moving around the community. So I think and I say that just to say that I think there is a balance. There's a time for us white men to shut up and get out of the conversation and listen. And I guess we'll kind of address this later on and when we talk about privilege too, but I think there's also times when we have to acknowledge that we can shift the dynamic in a conversation, and especially I think more so in places like the Adirondacks, maybe than other more metropolitan city areas. So that was one point I wanted to make. The other good practice that I think I would add to that is on trying to remove defensiveness not from your vocabulary, but from your actions. And I guess this kind of goes back to something Adam was saying too, but if you're doing this work, you're going to get called out by other people that you're working with and the people that you believe you're working for. And getting defensive when you get called out in those situations is incredibly unproductive. And I think that if you find yourself getting defensive, you have to pause and ask why that's the case. And this takes practice. I used to be terrible about it. I still have times when I can't do it well now, but I think it goes back to just accepting somebody else's lived experience and not suddenly pushing back from your place as a white dude. So yeah, those are a couple things that I would throw in there.
I would love to jump in on what Chris and Paul just said. I think one way to help with what can be a great deal of discomfort at times, and having to struggle with being called out, and having to struggle with the positives and negatives and challenges of this, is to remember something Adam said, which is often hard for people to grasp, and that is that in large part, what we have to work against and fight against is structural racism. And that's a target and an area that doesn't have to challenge you in the same way, but can give you something that I was going to add to this, which is staying power. You said commitment, Adam. I like the idea of staying power. Structural racism can be hard to recognize, and you have to build your perspective to fully understand it, but it's there to embrace, and it's there to give you staying power. It can be obvious, and it can be less obvious, but it's terribly important to me that we think about how our entire social structure has codified racism, particularly against Black people. And we live it all the time. I teach in a prison in the North Country, and my class is 90% people of color, and about 85% are Black inmates. That is structural racism. There's no way around it. The college I used to teach at before I moved here had a policy of over-enrolling. So, you know, they have a class limit of 25, and on purpose, they'd enroll 30 to 35. And that's because the college knew that a certain percentage of students would drop, and ultimately we get under the limit. So that way the college makes more money. That's fine. But 80 to 90% of the students who drop were Black. That's structural racism. It's a little hard to see it sometimes. You know, that's a subtle example of how it works. One more example quickly, in the city I used to live in, very progressive, Madison, Wisconsin, the graduation rate for Black men age 18 from high school was in the mid 50s, and the incarceration rate, either jail or prison, for Black men in their of 18 was also in the mid 50s. That's structural racism, and it's an outrage. And so when we apply ourselves to standing up and fighting and being accomplices or actors or agents, however you say it, against those kinds of things, it's not just about people. It's about ideas that are so entrenched in our culture that only with perspective and staying power can we get at them.
Thank you, Pete. You know, and you're absolutely right. These structures took a long time to build. We've been building them in this country for hundreds of years. We're not going to be able to dismantle them overnight. You know, the disproportionate representation of especially Black men who are incarcerated is really a pretty striking example of structural racism. One other one that I can give from a field that I used to work in, Black children are disproportionately represented in the child welfare system. And that's also structural racism. In the first anti-racism session, Dr. Cromwell talked about their experience as a Black person in academia. And they talked about being pathologized, marginalized, and surveilled. And this happens to people of color all the time. And that trio of actions is one of the main reasons why Black children are so disproportionately represented. And especially, you know, being turned in to CPS through the actions of mandated reporters, like doctors and hospitals. There was a study that showed that, you know, Black parents bringing their child to an emergency room for an injury were many times more likely to have Child Protective Services called on them than a white family, and for their explanations about injuries to not be believed. So this is how these ideas manifest materially. Paul, do you want to add something?
Sure, I'll be brief. I know that we're coming up on the halfway mark. I want to reflect on something that Chris said at the beginning, and that, you know, I think part of best practices, two things actually that Chris said that I think are quite powerful. For me, best practices are having courage, and that's courage to stand up in circumstances where I'm afraid I might lose friends or colleagues or acquaintances because they might not what I say might challenge them in ways in which they're not interested in continuing to be part of that conversation. So that's something that I think is really about best practices, is finding that place of discomfort, of being able to say, you know, I'm not okay with that comment, and, you know, can we explore that, please? Being able to be polite and to transition something that's unacceptable into a place of conversation is hard. And knowing how people are going to react to that is extremely difficult to predict. But having the courage to do that, I think that's a very important part of best practices. And I also want to reflect on the idea of being open to listening and learning other people's experience, lived experience, because it's something that we don't have. I don't have. I can't possibly pretend to have that. And the only way that I can continue to grow and to become a stronger accomplice or ally or actor or agent, as Pete was saying, is if I'm able to listen and learn and understand more deeply the wide range of places that systemic racism seeps into everyday life. And that's part of dismantling my own privilege in order to be able to understand others' lived experience.
Great. I just want to point out something, a comment from Jane Hall about, again, words matter, and to be conscious about not using terms that dehumanize people who are incarcerated, like inmate, felon, prisoner, offender. So thank you very much for that, Jane. That's a very, very important reminder. And it's real. This is one thing that's so hard about doing this, is that being so self-aware takes a tremendous amount of work. It's really tough, but it's really critical. So, you know, Pete, going back to what you were talking about being in this for the long haul and having staying power, can you talk a little bit, any of you three, about what helps to keep you motivated?
I'd love to. The problems that we're working on are difficult, and there are, you know, there's a lot of pain and heartache in our world and in our society, but the work is positive. That's really important, I think, to say. It can be hard, and as Chris and Paul and I have all said, discomfort, finding some measure of courage, that has to be part of it, because this isn't easy, but it is positive work. And I want to say that competence and consciousness in people is an overarching goal. When you develop your own perspective by listening, by learning, by examining, by questioning yourself, it's not about judging somebody else. It's about enriching yourself. And when we help people do that, when we help people raise their competence, and their consciousness about these issues, and when we do it, particularly as white men from a position of privilege, we're doing work that's really affirming. And it affirms, among other things, that most people, you know, in the world are decent people. They don't always know what they don't know, but we can teach people. I'm an educator. And it's really, really important that we think of this as positive work. And that certainly sustains me. The other thing that I'll just throw in, because I have to, is, you know, all of this is informed by moral and ethical issues and the kind of compass that you have. And there you go. Somebody needs to mute. There you go. All of this is. I lost my train of thought there. But anyhow, it's affirming work, it's positive work, and it's the right thing to do. That's what I was going to say. You know, if you look at the moral and ethical implications, sometimes it's very simple to say, well, no, wait a minute. Have a measure of courage here, because the right thing to do is this. At this moment, at this time, it's not that hard to see that. And that's a positive thing to do. The more that you do that, the more affirming it is.
Great, thank you.
Oh, sorry. I can jump in. I just want to say hi to Jane too. We keep meeting over Zoom and never in real life. So nice that Jane is here. In terms of what keeps me motivated, I'd say big picture, like every headline from like the last several decades keep me motivated. But I'll give 2 examples locally. Starting in 2015, I started meeting with Black students and students of color at North Country Community College in Saranac Lake. And a lot of those meetings were informal and in nature, but a lot of them focused on their stories of what it was like to be a Black person in Saranac Lake as a student. And I could do a whole webinar on how infuriating and ridiculous those stories are. And they really underscore how much we have blinders on when it comes to racism in this community. In Saranac Lake and across the Adirondacks, not wanting to go downtown because they felt too visible, taking their business to McDonald's and Subway because those places feel familiar, getting pulled over for slow rolling through a stop sign and having 3 police cruisers show up. And they're paying tuition and room and board and getting an education here. And you know, those stories are so silent and ignored. And so just those conversations over the years keep me motivated. And the other part is working with the youth programs. And I'll talk about the positive sides of that later on, I think, because they've been amazing experiences. But in some situations, watching how people I know in the community react to these groups of kids who are coming here to have fun, people going out of their way to follow us and keep an eye on us while we're going for a hike or walking around downtown Saranac Lake, getting asked repeatedly, all the way up to 2020, are these kids here for a basketball camp? That question has not gone away in 5 years of me doing this work. Asking if they're groups of troubled youth. Just the assumptions and stereotypes made. It's fucking infuriating, and I apologize for swearing. But that's really strong motivation for me, and I hope I hope for other people too. So yeah, that's what keeps me motivated. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to focus on the negative so much, but there you go.
I mean, sometimes it's the negative that keeps you going. And the example you were just giving is really kind of speaks to what Dr. Cromwell spoke about in the first meeting about the pathologization of people of color, right? Being asked, you know, are these troubled kids? So, all right.
I would just, sure. Just briefly to the question of motivation. For me, it's as simple as saying that once you see something, you can't unsee it. So the first part of my life when I was, you know, perfectly, you know, happy and took the world as it was. And, you know, it didn't really think about much beyond my own immediate day-to-day activities. And I didn't think about the roles and the experiences of others. As I began to become more involved in that, first through women's issues and then into issues of diversity more broadly, as you begin to see these things that you want to change and as they continue unchanged, you can't look away. So the motivation is, I wouldn't say it's a negative one for me at least, although I share Chris in some of those absolutely infuriating experiences that we have on a daily basis working with individuals. But the motivation for me is that now that I know that what is happening and actually systems that are happening today that are trying to maintain the disparity and inequality and injustice. So the motivation is that I can't unsee what is unfair and I'll never stop working to try and change it.
Great, thank you, Paul. So it's getting close to, we've got about 20 minutes left. So how would you feel if we turned it over to some questions from the other participants?
Absolutely.
There are a couple great ones here already. So talking about seeing something, when you see racism, can you give an example of how to start a conversation that leads to a purposeful discussion as opposed to denial and defensiveness?
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
You know, so Chris, Pete, you guys mind if I go first on this one?
Go.
Sure. So I just had a very recent experience with this in my own town. So we were talking about the chalk in Saranac Lake, and several weeks prior to that, we had a chalk incident here in our town. And it happened to have been it was a series of young women in town that were one afternoon chalking on the basketball court, and it got washed away. It turns out one of the young women who was involved was actually 2 of them were my daughters. So I wound up in town hall because town hall called and said, hey, your daughter's name is signed on this Black Lives Matters thing. And, we want you to ask them please to clean it up because it's, it's defacing public property. So I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, wow, Black Lives Matter is defacing public property. So at any rate, this was a moment of either I was like, yeah, no, you can go fly a kite. I'm not having my daughters clean it up. Or sure, I'm going to have my daughters clean it up. But I said, but you need to tell me why. And then this opened the proverbial can of worms for every seemingly non-racist statement that comes out there. Well, I'm not against Black people. I think all lives matter, all of these tropes. And so we wound up having a 45-minute conversation in the town hall with 3 individuals who represented the town, working through all these ideas. And it was really uncomfortable at some points because it was 3 people who could not understand why I didn't see that Black Lives Matters chalked on the chalkboard on the basketball court was clearly defacing public property. It was a very interesting conversation, but it was also one in which we all got to share our different perspectives. And I think that was really powerful. I did not expect to have that kind of a conversation. I didn't expect it to last that long, and I didn't expect at the end to have as much openness, even if, quote unquote, one individual said, well, nothing's here changed my mind, but, okay. And that was an interesting compromise in and of itself. The opening part of that sentence was, nothing's changed my mind, but okay, I'm willing to allow the change to happen anyway. So it was interesting. But yeah, it's a scary moment. I mean, you're on that lip of the waterfall, and you don't know if you're going to go over and get dashed on the rocks or if you're going to go over and bob to the surface. And every time you're on the lip of that waterfall, you feel it and you feel the water accelerate, and you just don't know how big the rocks are below. But you got to swim over anyway.
I don't mind following up, and I'll use another example that happened somewhat recently. And I'd just say, for starters, if you want to know what I do and how I approach that conversation, I start with a really deep breath because it can be really easy to just, I can spiral really quickly into just being really mad, and that's not productive. And that's not, as white people, especially in these rural communities, our default can't be to get really mad and then disengage, because then we're not doing anything. So I had a really great conversation with someone who I do work for, which is also a weird power dynamic. So the person that was paying my, writing a check to me on a monthly basis, pushing back against that person is not an easy thing to do. But the conversation was actually followed, the first of these webinars, with Clifton, Dr. Cromwell, and with Nikki. And the question was, I thought I learned a lot, but I wish that the tone wasn't so aggressive, which is something that white people love to do as it pertains to racism, the tone policing, forcing everybody to engage with white people's rules of civility, which is a whole other topic, I guess, where we need to reckon with that. So my instinct was to ignore and just let it go, and then I realized that's not how this works. I need to push back and explain why that's problematic, and say, that we've got centuries of Black people trying to play by white people's rules, and look how far we've come, which is not very far, unfortunately. So I pushed back, and I had that conversation, and it was uncomfortable. But I think by the end, I feel pretty confident in saying that the person that I spoke with, I think, understood why tone policing in that situation is problematic. And so, I mean, that's not overt racism, but that is the sort of unconscious racism that we're also trying to grapple with too. So there's my response.
I'll jump in with my 2 cents to be very short. There's a great deal of sensitivity as just being a human being, being a person, being yourself, I think, that's required to navigate the best way to have a conversation or to do what seems the right at the moment. And it can follow a spectrum from somewhat uncomfortable to extremely uncomfortable and everything in between. You got to put the discomfort aside. So I guess in general, trying to offer different perspective on what you heard. It begins a conversation that's not about judging, and begins a conversation where people can share their different perspectives, and that's how people learn. On the other hand, there are times when you simply have to say, let's say in the company of people who were a offensive racist joke is told, no, I'm offended by that. I'm offended by that. Here's why. Here's why it bothers me. My friends, my colleagues, my coworkers, my close friends. I have a child of color, not black, but one of our 3 children is a child of color. You stand up at those times, and that's necessary too. And the thing about that, and I don't know how Chris and Paul will comment on this, is as you do that, it gets easier. It gets easier to stand on the principle that you believe in and say the things that you need to say. It's not as dangerous as you think it is, and it's not as negative as you think it is, as long as Chris pointed out, you try to control your anger. So there's really a set of gradations about how you approach this. But ultimately, changing people's perspective or opening it, widening it, is the ball game for me.
Great, thanks, Pete. So related to, we've got another question here that's related to starting and having difficult conversations, and it's got a couple parts. So how do we handle the dynamic around policing prison that has developed in rural white America? Relatively poor white folks who have achieved some degree of financial security, thanks to their jobs with the police prison industry, are very resistant to conversations that implicate them and their employers. How do we break through?
Well, I mean, the starting point is, I think we need to reassure people. Sorry, let me back up. Yes, that conversation can come across as threatening because these are individuals, as you said, whose livelihood are dependent on that prison industrial complex, so to speak. But the key is that we have to highlight that it's not the prison per se, and it's not their job per se, but it's the sentencing laws, it's the arresting procedures, it's the profiling procedures. So it's the feeder system that really needs to be addressed. Obviously, I don't mean in any way, shape, or form to say that there isn't a lot of reform that has to happen in the prisons themselves. Absolutely. But I think you can open that, and specific to this question, you can open the conversation by trying to reassure someone that the conversation is broader than their job, and it's broader than their boss or where they work. It has to do with our society and how our society disproportionately incarcerates people of color, period, end of story. We have to address that. And that's a systemic thing. That's not an employment thing. That's at least how I'd start that conversation.
Yeah,
I'm totally, sorry.
No, I think what you're saying, Paul, can be really effective in kind of decentering the individual. And again, moving back to this structure and systems. So it makes it seem less aggressive and condemning when you take that tack.
And the other part of that, and I do, Chris, I appreciate that you want to comment, so I'll be brief, but also the other piece of this is that it helps, or at least if I'm hopeful, that it helps highlight that what we are trying to talk about is systemic stuff and not individual stuff. Because any individual you talk to is like, oh, me, I'm not a racist. Of course you're not a racist. But the system is biased, and we have to acknowledge that systemic piece, and we need to be able to show people where those systems are so that you can say, look, it's not you. You're the whole issue about, police officers and, well, gosh, I've got a family member who's a police officer and he's a great person, absolutely, unequivocally. But we still have to look at the systemic nature of policing that disproportionately impacts people of color. Chris.
Oh, I was going to say just that I'm totally okay acknowledging that I haven't had a lot of these conversations because I don't feel like I have enough of a knowledge base to have the conversations around this. But I was going to make the point about changing it from the individual to the systemic issues, because I think that is one way to do it. And I think the other part of it too maybe is also acknowledging that the way prisons have been set up here in the North Country were set up as a job creation tool for those individuals. So instead of addressing other job issues or workforce issues or educational issues that are also prevalent here, outside of race, the socioeconomic poverty in the North Country, rather than address those systemic issues, prisons were built here as a solution, you know. So, I mean, that's maybe another thing to bring into that conversation.
And I'll add my voice, although I teach in the prison. I'm going to go with policing for a second. In a prior life, I worked with police officers quite a bit. I wasn't a police officer myself, but I worked with police officers on a variety of things. One of them was community policing. And I want to go back, it's really the same thing. These systemic issues are really hard to get at, but it begins with conversations and changes in perspective. So, for example, if you talk to a police officer or actually talk to somebody who can schedule and structure the way police work during the day, have them put police walking the beat more, get them out of the car, get them out of just responding to law enforcement or public safety issues, and have them walk a beat, because conversations start and perspectives change. And by and large, as a general statement, the police officers I've worked with, which is hundreds over the years, the ones who are out in the communities getting to know people had a completely different attitude about their own job. They were completely professional, and they knew that they had to enforce the law, and they knew they had to guarantee public safety, but their perspective on how that's done, which was more problem solving than it was confronting, also changed how they engaged with these systemic issues. When you have conversations with people and you get to know people in your neighborhood, people that you may not have gotten to know before or may not have understood before, and your perspective widens, these structural problems start to be attacked. They start to be changed. And it's a long process, as you said, Adam, but that's the process.
Thank you, Pete. So here's a great question. Can you talk for a moment about how you handle it when you make a mistake, like using the wrong term or failing to incorporate different perspectives?
Sure, own it. We've all made lots of mistakes. I've made a variety of mistakes over the last month. I have, I'm gonna get personal here for a second. I have developed a friendship with Nikki Hilton Patterson, the director of the Diversity Initiative. For me, our friendship comes first. And just listening to her as a friend, as somebody that you hang with and eat with and talk with and go through things with is enlightening. And it's enlightening, even though I would think of myself as having some experience in this area. It's enlightening when you realize how many mistakes you make as a white guy with privilege, how much you have to learn. It's not about, it can't be about judging. In a large picture it is. I mean, I'm outraged by this gradient that I talked about. I'm outraged by it. It just pisses me off, much like it does Chris. But it has to be about a very human endeavor, and acknowledging and admitting mistakes and whatever you do, slips of the tongue or gross misunderstandings, of which there are many. You simply have to own it and try to be a little better the next day and learn. Man, we all do that. That's life. So let's do it here.
Yeah, I mean, I think no one likes being criticized. From our earliest socialization and education, we're taught that you want to be right. You want to have the right answer in class. We all know about how difficult it is sometimes to raise your hand in class and have the wrong answer, and there's that judgment there. So our whole lives we're conditioned not to be wrong. And when you lay that piece as a foundation for then something as sensitive as issues of race, yeah, it can be really uncomfortable to think about being wrong. But I think Pete's point is important. In our everyday lives, no matter what we're doing, whether we're parents, whether we're coworkers, whether we're colleagues, whether we're citizens who are speeding and stopped by a police officer, whatever it is that we're doing, we're constantly getting feedback on how to improve our behavior. And so my answer on how do you respond when you're wrong or do something wrong is the same way you respond when you're doing anything wrong. It's a different, more sensitive area, but the response is the same. You're like, wow, I'm really sorry. Thanks for explaining that to me. I will be sensitive to that in the future and move forward.
So a few years ago, there was a controversy, maybe, I don't know if that's the right word, about the Winter Carnival theme in Saranac Lake. The theme was Fiesta, which was which was a wrong choice. It was a dumb idea for a lot of reasons. And when that happened, I had very close friends who spoke up against it and presented very reasoned, passionate arguments for why it was the wrong choice. And I provided maybe like wishy-washy support at best. It was because I was afraid of speaking out. I was afraid of standing with them and speaking out. And even though I believed them and I agreed, I was more worried about the backlash from, like I talked about earlier, I was more worried about backlash from people I grew up with than I was about doing the right thing. So I fucked up on that, and I should have been there and I wasn't. And when we talk about using your position as a white male with privilege, that was exactly what I'm talking about. A situation where Chris Morris, born and raised in Saranac Lake, could have walked into the room and made a difference, I think, and provided more support. I mean, they ended up getting rid of the theme, which was good, but I didn't do the right thing. I regret it and I don't regret it, which sounds weird, but I think the point there is that was a mistake, but I've used it as motivation going forward. And it's why I'm trying to be more intentional when I do realize those situations where I can leverage my voice and make a difference there. So that's a really weird example in the context of like police brutality and systemic racism, but again, it's a real one. So I think if you let the mistakes force you into inaction, that's the wrong way to do it. And if you let the mistakes deter you and silence you and cause you to back out, that's a bad approach. But so yeah, I think I don't know. I think I said it.
You did.
Thank you, Chris. We've got time for one more question, and so this one is really appreciating the perspective from Chris on what it's like to be a local in the North Country and the importance of leveraging that privilege to facilitate conversation. Would love to hear more about the dynamic of lean in versus lean out for white males in this rural space. How do we create space for Black voices when there are still so few in our community? How do we speak up, again, as white men with rural roots, without reinforcing the problematic power dynamics that we benefit from?
I use that word intentional, and that seems like a jargony word to me, but that's where I try to, actually, no, let me back up. Especially now that we have some incredible leaders with ADI and with other groups, I want to point out too, Jane and North Country Surge and Wake the North Country and the High Peaks Democratic Socialist America group, all these organizations, I try to look to those other leaders, like Nikki and like Aaron Cass and some other people I've been lucky to work with, and just ask, like, when is my voice going to be additive right now and make an impact, or is this a good time for me to back off and let other voices be in the room? So there's my answer. That's a simple answer. Trust the people you're working with to offer some guidance, because I think they will.
I think that's right on. And the other part of that is to seek new voices. I mean, I think that's been the work of the diversity initiative. When Pete and I and others started it, one of our first actions was to recognize that we're not the experts. We need to find the people who are, and we need to invite them into the conversation.
Great. Well, it looks like we are just about out of time. So I'd like to thank everybody again for participating, and thank Nikki Hilton Patterson and the Adirondack Diversity Initiative for hosting these super important discussions. We're really lucky to have the ADI here doing this kind of work at this time. So thank you, and good night, everybody.
Thank you for hosting.
Yes, thank you.